Today we're going to look at the free response questions in detail. And we're going to talk about some general strategies you can use, and then we'll tackle the first type of free response question that you're going to see on the exam, which is the methods and control structures topic. So first I want to start with a few key details about the free response questions. So first of all, there are 4 free response questions and you have an hour and a half to do them. So that generally means that you have about 20 minutes per question, and then you'll have 10 minutes left over at the end to review all of your free responses. So you want to make sure that you allocate enough time for yourself to get to every single free response question, and then at the end also be able to come back to free response questions that you might have skipped over to work on those really challenging parts. The second thing that you want to remember is that free response questions are handwritten. So that means that you need to practice this. So I'm going to go through and code in our editor the free response question for today, but I encourage you, as you are working on these free response questions and practicing for this, to make sure that you practice handwriting, because handwriting code is a different skill than being able to type code. Okay, that means you're not going to have any assistance from the editor, and your hand might cramp up halfway through. So that's another skill that you want to practice, and it can affect how much time it's going to take you to write these answers. The third key detail is that you earn points for every single thing you do correctly. So even if you just wrote down to creating one variable, if you did that in the correct way, you may earn points for that. So even if you don't know the entire solution to a problem, you should try to write down at least what you know so that you can earn points for those parts. Now let's talk about a few strategies that go into answering free response questions. So first of all, the first step in every free response question is to really understand what you're being asked. So you should take some time right at the beginning, usually 3 to 5 minutes, to read the question and determine what that question requires. Every free response question is going to have some code that's given to you and then some code that you have to write yourself. And so part of that first reading is understanding, okay, here's the parts of the question that I have to answer, and here's the parts of the code that they already gave me to use. The second strategy is to make a note of special requirements that they mention. Sometimes they want to see if you know how to reuse methods or to use methods that they've given you. And you might be able to write a solution that works without using the method that they gave you. But if they have a special note that says you must use method X in your solution correctly to earn credit, then you have to follow that special requirement. So make a note of those as you're reading through the question. The third strategy is to really plan out what your strategy or what your solution is going to look like before you start implementing it, right? So strategize. Okay, I'm going to work on this part first, and then I'm going to work on this part second, because a lot of those pieces of each free response question are contingent on each other. So you're going to need to use what you wrote in the first part to work on the second part. This is a big topic in the AP test where they're trying to emphasize that coding generally builds on itself. And so strategizing how you're going to answer the entire question before you start writing your code is going to ensure that you're aware of how those pieces are related to each other before you actually start writing your solution. Now, those are just some general strategies and details to remember as you go into the free response questions. At this point, we're going to jump into actually looking at an example of a free response question so that we can practice these skills together. We're going to look at the first type of free response question on the exam, which is going to be a free response question on methods and control structures. This is the first free response question that's given to you in the official AP Computer Science A course and exam description. This is question 1 on methods and control structures. So let's read through this question together and we'll go through the process of solving this particular problem. So this question involves the use of check digits, which can be used to help detect if an error has occurred when a number is entered or transmitted electronically. Okay, so we're computing something called check digit. We don't know exactly what that means, but they're going to give us an algorithm for computing a check digit based on the digits of a number. Okay, so right off the bat, we know that this has something to do with algorithms for numbers, right? This is going to be working with numbers. It's probably going to be working with ints, it sounds like, since they haven't really talked about decimals in these numbers. So right off the bat, you have some idea of the kind of lessons that you can go back to figure out what you might be trying to do in this problem, right? You want to look back at the lesson on algorithms for numbers. Unit 4, Lesson 2. You may also want to go back and look at Unit 1 to refresh your memory on ints and how you work with ints. Okay, so the check digit class is shown below. You'll write 2 methods of the check digit class. Okay, so there are 2 methods they're going to ask us to write. So the first method here is public static int get check to be implemented in part A. If there are multiple parts to an FRQ question, you're going to see that they'll be indicated by letters. So part A, part B, you can see that this particular question is asking us to write 2 different methods. So public static int get check returns the check digit for num. Okay. And then we have a precondition which says the number of digits in num is between 1 and 6 inclusive. Okay, great. So we'll come back to this as we start to solve the actual problem, but we're just getting kind of a lay of the land here to see what the different parts of this class are. All right, so next up we have public static boolean is valid. And this actually has a parameter we pass in, which is an int called num with check digit. Returns true if num with check digit is valid or false otherwise. Okay. So we're going to look through this num with check digit and find out if it has a check digit or if it's valid. All right, we don't know exactly what that means yet, but we know that these are the 2 methods that we have to write for part A and part B. All right, let's look down and see what other code they've given us. Okay, so down here we have 2 methods. One is public static int get number of digits, and it says implementation not shown. All right, implementation not shown is a really key phrase that you're going to see come up over and over again in free response questions. And basically what that means is we have to assume that this function works, that this method does what it's intended to do, but we don't know exactly how it works. And you can almost guarantee that in the code they're asking you to write, you need to use this method. You need to use it in your solution, or at least you should use it in your solution, and it's going to help you to solve the problem that they're asking you to solve. But we're not going to be shown how it's written. Okay, so we have another implementation not shown right here, which is public static int get digit, which you have a num you pass in, and then a index n, which gives you the digit at that location. Okay, so this is useful. This is kind of helpful to us. We have these 2 helper methods. One is get the number of digits. The other one is get a specific digit. So we can basically tell how long a number is, and we can get specific numbers in different positions. All right, so now we have kind of a general idea what the class does or how it's set up. Let's scroll down and have a look at the problem itself. Okay, so part A, complete the get check method, which computes the check digit for a number according to the following rules. 3 rules. Multiply the first digit by 7, the second digit, if one exists, by 6, the third by 5, and so on. The length of the method's int parameter is at most 6. Therefore, the last digit of a 6-digit number will be multiplied by 2. Okay? Add the products calculated in the previous step. Okay, so add all those numbers together, and then extract the check digit, which is the rightmost digit of the sum calculated in the previous step. Okay, and then here's a few examples of how that would look. Right? You have a number 283415. It's going to be 2 times 7, 8 times 6, 3 times 5, 4 times 4, 1 times 3, 5 times 2. Add those together and then get the rightmost digit, which is 6. Okay, so then I wanted to make a special note here that you see it says 2 helper methods have been provided. These were the ones we talked about, get number of digits and get digit. These are going to be useful in completing get check, and right here it says you must complete the get check method below. You must use get number of digits and get digit appropriately to receive full credit. Okay, this is one of those special conditions I was mentioning in the last video, or the general tips video, which basically is telling us, all right, there are other ways to write this solution, but for this particular problem, they want to see you use these 2 methods appropriately in order to receive full credit. Okay, so that's part A. Now we can sort of think about this and begin to strategize, right? Okay, so we're able to get number of digits and we're able to get digit. Then to get check, what we basically need to do is write a loop, right, that goes through all of the digits in num. So it's going to go from, let's see, we're going to start at 1 and we're going to go up to get number of digits, right? So that would get us all the way through the number. And then we're going to multiply those times a decreasing value. So we'll have to figure out a loop that goes through and multiplies those times decreasing values. And then we're going to sum those together. And then at the end, we have to figure out how to get the rightmost digit. All right, we'll dig into this in the coding window in a minute here. Before I do that, though, I want to read the second part of the question to make sure that I understand the full picture of what's going on. So part B says, write the isValid method. The method returns true if its parameter num with check digit, which represents a number containing a check digit, is valid, and false otherwise. The check digit is always the rightmost digit of num with check digit. Okay, so the following example shows how you would use isValid. All right, so method called getCheck on 159. So the check digit is 2, right? So this is actually the method that you wrote in part A. Okay, so what we're wondering here is, does the number 2, is it in the last place here, right? So we're saying that with these first 3 digits, is this a valid check digit for everything else in the number? Let me say that again, because this one you'll notice is false, because for 159, we know that the check digit is going to be 2, but here, this number has a 3 in the last right-hand place. So let's rephrase this for ourselves, right? What's basically happening here is we're looking at a number and we're saying, is the rightmost digit the correct check digit for all the other numbers? Or for everything on the left-hand side of that last digit? If it is, we say true, and if it's not, we say false. So what we're going to have to do here is somehow we're going to have to separate the first number and the rest of the number, or the right-hand digit and the rest of the number, and then we're going to use getCheck to determine if the check digit matches what this number has as the rightmost digit. Okay? So now let's jump into the code and actually try working out this solution together, now that we have a general idea of what this program is supposed to do. We're going to jump into coding the solution here in a second, but before we do that, I just want to make sure that we reiterate how important it is to use the methods that they give you, these helper methods, get number of digits and get digit, appropriately. That means that you can call them, but you also need to call them appropriately, which basically means you have to understand exactly how they work. So I kind of glossed over these examples here, but if you ever have a question about how some code they give you functions, make sure you go back and look into the documentation or the free response question itself, because they should give you examples of it running. All right, so the first example here says get number of digits of 283415, and it says the return value is 6, right? So this means that if the number has 6 digits, it's going to give you 6. It's not going to give you 5, starting at 0 or something like that. It is going to give you the total count of those digits. The second method call here says get digit of that number 283415, and then get digit 1. And that's going to return the number 2, because they're saying that the first digit of 283415 is 2. All right, so that means that they're starting on the left-hand side in terms of how they're counting the indexes of these digits. So digit 1 is actually this number 2. And then here you see it says the 5th digit, get digit of 283415, 5, the 5th digit is 1, right? So what they're showing us here really is that the 5th digit is not, because normally when you index letters in a string, we would say they go from 0 to length minus 1. But in this case, they're showing us that the way this code works is that actually when you get to the 5th digit, it's going to give you the 5th number and not the last number. And so in order to get the last digit of this number, you would need to call get digit 283415 6, because that would actually give you the last number, because that's the 6th digit of this number. Okay, so now let's look at coding up our solution. So here we have a setup where we've written our public class check digit, and the first method we're working on is getCheck. So you might find it useful at this point to actually write some notes down, and hopefully you're practicing this on paper, so I encourage you to try writing this out before you watch the rest of this video. So feel free to pause now and try to write your own solution up, because we're now going to go through the correct solution for how to write the getCheck method. Okay, so I kind of like to write comments to remind myself of what I'm supposed to do, right? So I'm going to go through each digit, multiply first by 7, second by 6 to the end, add those numbers together, return the last digit of the total. Okay, so I think that sort of gives me, I've now got my head wrapped around this a little bit. So I'm going to write a for loop, and I want to loop through all the numbers, but because remember, getDigit doesn't start indexes at 0, it starts them at 1, so I'm going to set n to equal 1 to start out. That's going to be my index. And then my stopping condition is going to be, or I'm going to loop for as long as n is less than or equal to get number of digits of my num, right? So that's going to enable n to go from 1 all the way up to the number of digits. And then I'm adding 1 to n each time. Okay, so inside of this for loop, I'm going to need to keep track of a total. So make sure, let's actually create a total variable and set that to 0. So here I'm going to say total plus equals. Now it's going to be, let's see, get digit. And remember, I'm getting the digits of the number num, and I'm getting n. Okay, and then I need to multiply this times something. So let's think about this. If I'm getting the first digit of this number, then that first digit is going to be multiplied times 7, right? And then the second digit is going to be multiplied times 6. So the third number is going to be multiplied times 5. I need to be counting down. So the way that I can do that is I'm going to base my multiplication on this number n. And since my first case is a 1-digit number, where I multiply this digit times 7, my calculation here can be 8 minus n, because n is going to be 1, and so this will be 7. And then that will be 6 when I look at the next digit, and as I go through the rest of the number, this will give me the correct value. Okay, so that's adding those numbers together. Done that. And then the last thing is going to be to return the last digit of total. So how do I do that? Well, there are a couple ways to do this. You may remember that you can do mod 10 of any number to get the ones digit. And so I can just return this. Or you could use getDigit if you want it to be fancy and actually get digit based on the number of digits. Let's be fancy, so let's try that. Get digit, right, total. Get number of digits, right, because this is going to be the index of total. All right, and that should return the last digit of this total value. All right, that is part A. In our next video, we'll come back and do part B. Okay, in this video, we are going to look at solving part B of the free response question, check digit. And in this part, remember, we have to write a method called isValid that returns a Boolean where it's telling us whether this number, num with check digit, contains a correct check digit as its last digit. So again, whenever I like to solve these problems, I'm going to write some pseudocode or write some comments first to remind myself what I need to do. So step 1 is going to be to separate last digit from the rest of the number, right? I want to break the number into 2 parts so that I can work with those individually so I can check if the last digit is the correct check digit for the rest of the number. All right, the next part is going to be calculate check digit for rest of the number, and then return true or false if they match. So step 1 is separating the last digit from the rest of the number. I can do this by saving the last digit into a variable by using mod 10. Now you could have used your helper method, get digit, but in this case I'm not required to do so, or at least I don't think I am. So now it's time to actually go back and check the free response question to determine if that's the case. So here's part B in our description of the free response question. And you notice here that it says complete method is valid below. Assume that getCheck works as specified. GetCheck is the method we wrote in part A, regardless of what you wrote in part A. So we can just assume that that works. And then it says you must use getCheck appropriately to receive full credit. Here's that phrase again. You must use getCheck appropriately to receive full credit. Right? So what that means is we don't necessarily have to use getDigit and getNumberOfDigits, the other two helper methods, but we do have to use the method we wrote in part A. Remember I mentioned earlier in the tips video that free response questions often build on each other, right? If they have 2 parts or 3 parts, you can expect that what you did in part A is going to be useful and actually required in parts B and in part C. So you want to keep that in mind, because as you're writing your solution, if you're not using the previous parts of the question, you may have missed something. All right, so now that we know we have to use getCheck, let's return to our code. So I don't have to use getDigit. I'm just going to use mod 10 here to get the last digit of my number. The next thing I want to do is get rest of number, which is going to be everything except the last digit. Now, there's a few different ways you could do this, but the best way that I know of to do this is to divide the number by 10. And what's going to happen here is that we're going to divide by 10 and we're going to have a decimal component, but then because this is integer division, it's automatically going to be truncated and we will have only left over the rest of the number, right? Because let's say you had 19. 19 divided by 10 is 1.9, but because these are both integers, that would turn into 1 because the 0.9 would get truncated off and we would just have the rest of the number. The next thing I want to do is calculate the check digit. So here is where I need to use the method that I wrote in part A. Use it appropriately. Okay, so I'm going to look up here and I'm going to check. I see that, okay, the method is called getCheck and I have to pass in an int called num, or I have to pass in an int. So I'm going to say getCheck and I pass in not my original number, but the rest of the number. All right, I pass this in and getCheck is going to return to me the int check digit. Okay, and then the last part is going to be returning true or false based on these two numbers. I want to see if check digit is equal to last digit. So I'll use an if statement here. I say if check digit equals last digit, return true. Else, return false. Now, some of you may have been saying, oh, but you don't have to use an else. You could just return false because if you return true, then it would have ended the function. There are other ways to make this more efficient, but this I think is the most straightforward way to verify whether check digit equals last digit. Okay, that is the end of your solution for this particular free response question. In the next video, we'll look at grading the solutions and look at the answers provided by the College Board. Free response question scoring. In this video, we're going to look at how to score the free response question that we just went over, but I wanted to address a few important points before we jump into the details of scoring. The first general idea is that you earn points, but rarely lose points. So what I mean by that is there are very few specific reasons why you might lose points, but for the most part, you earn points for everything that you write. And I will say this over and over again, but what that means is that you should write everything you know. It is always going to help you to write down any idea that you have, just on the off chance that you might get the answer partially correct, in which case you'll earn partial points. So the next general point is that each free response question is worth 9 points total. This is usually broken up between different parts of the question, but overall, each question is going to be worth 9 points total. And then lastly, you will not have these scoring guidelines that we're going to go over in this video on the test. So, of course, they can't give you these scoring guidelines because that would give away some of the answer. But these scoring guidelines are going to be available for your practice questions, and it's really good practice to look over the scoring guidelines to understand exactly what the AP scorers are looking for when they review your responses. All right, folks, this is our last video on the first free response question on methods and control structures. So this first part of the video, we're going to look at the general scoring criteria that's going to be applied to every question, and then we're going to look at the specific scoring criteria for the questions we just did. So these general scoring criteria are penalties or non-penalty mistakes that the scorers or the graders might notice in your code, and these are the instructions for how they would apply penalties. So you'll notice that there are a few things that would cause a 1-point penalty. Array and collection access confusion. So if you use square brackets instead of using get on an array list versus an array, that's going to be a 1-point penalty. The next 1-point penalty is extraneous code that causes side effects. So this is going to be things like printing to output, incorrect precondition checks. So these are basically things where if you have code that actually does something and that causes a side effect, but it's not related to your solution, then they're going to take away a point. Next up, we have local variables used, but none declared. Okay, so this is if you're actually using variables you didn't declare, well, that would actually cause an error in your code, and so that's going to be a 1-point penalty. Destruction of persistent data. Okay, this would be like if this is going to happen really if you're talking about passing in a class data type, and if you change the reference to it, even if it's not part of maybe the solution they were asking you to do, basically if you have impacted the rest of the program without realizing it, then that could be a 1-point penalty. Finally, messing up a return value. If you have a void method or constructor that's not supposed to return, but you do a return, that's going to be a 1-point penalty. All the rest of these mistakes are basically typos that they're not going to take a penalty off for. Okay, things like extraneous code or code with no side effects, things like spelling or messing up the case of your variables, as long as it's clear what you were trying to do, then you don't have to worry about losing points for this. Even things like missing curly braces when you were supposed to have those, forgetting to put a semicolon, using equals instead of equals equals. Again, as long as it's clear what you were trying to do, then you're not going to lose points for these things. Okay, so now let's look at the specific solutions for the problem we just did together. So first of all, part A is worth 4 points and part B is worth 5 points. Most free response questions, actually I think all free response questions are worth 9 points. So you can expect that there's going to be some kind of a breakdown between the points awarded for the different parts of the problem, depending on how complex they are. Okay, so these are the canonical solutions, which means these are the solutions that the College Board gives. They're not necessarily the way that you have to solve the problems, but this is probably the most straightforward way to do it. As you can see, it looks pretty similar to what we did in our demonstration in this video, with maybe a few things in different orders, but the overall impact is the same. Okay, so now let's look at the scoring criteria. So again, what I wanted to point out is that you earn points for things that you do. You don't lose points. Other than those 1-point penalties, which are pretty rare, you don't lose points for doing things incorrectly. You only earn points if you do things correctly, which means that you should always try to do something. For instance, the first point is for calling get number of digits and get digit. It doesn't even say that you call them correctly. It doesn't even say that you use them and then you save those values and that the logic is correct. It just wants to know, did you actually call these methods in some way, shape, or form? If you do that, you get 1 point. All right, next up is calculates one partial sum. Okay, so inside of your loop or in some way, did you add up some of the digits multiplied by some other digits, right? So again, this is saying, did you at least try the problem? Did you try to calculate at least one partial sum? Next up, we have calculates all partial sums. Okay, so this point's going to be a little tougher to get if you don't, this is basically like, did you actually do the whole problem? Did you calculate all partial sums? So again, getting these first 2 points is pretty straightforward. You only need like 1 line of code for each one of these. And then as the points get further down, they get a little more complicated and their expectations are a little higher. So here, finally, is the last one, which is returns the last digit of the calculated sum as the checked digit. did you actually get a calculated sum, and did you return the last digit? Now you'll notice here that you still get the point if you calculate the sum incorrectly. So even if you didn't have the correct sum added up, as long as you're returning the last digit of whatever you did calculate, you'd still get 1 point. So all of this is to say that even if your answer didn't solve the problem perfectly, say you messed up the logic of the partial sums, you're still going to earn 3 out of 4 points on this problem. So again, it's always a good idea to write down what you know and to try to attempt as many parts of the problem as you can. Now let's look at the second part of the grading. The grading for part B is valid. First point is obtains check digit of num with check digit. Okay, so this is getting that last digit of the number. Next up, obtains number remaining in num with check digit after the check digit's removed. Right, so looking and seeing, did you get the rest of the number that is left over after taking the check digit off? All right, next up, calls get check on number without check digit. Okay, so this is really a little bit more strict. This is saying, yeah, did you call get check, but did you call it on the correct number, the number without the check digit on the end? The last, or number 8, is compares check digit of num with check digit and return value from get check. Okay, so did you do the comparison correctly, right? Did you compare the check digit from the number you passed in with what you got from the method that you wrote in part A? And then your last point is, did you return true or false depending on the result of the previous comparison? So you don't necessarily have to use an if statement, but as long as you return true or false depending on the result of the comparison, then you would earn this 1 point. So again, I would just point out that you can earn these first 3 points without necessarily getting the answer correct. As long as you are making an attempt and you're doing some of the steps along the way, you're going to earn points for this. Okay, so those are the scoring criteria for this first question. And if you want now, you can go and look at your solutions and check them against these canonical solutions, and then take some time with your code and see if you can come up with a score for yourself based on these points.